For the development economist and the development policy specialist in our group today, either here or online, Uma Lele needs very little introduction. For others, let me try to condense an illustrious career of scholarship and development leadership into a brief introduction. Uma was the first woman to be awarded a PhD in agricultural economics at Cornell University. She did so at the age of 24, which I've confirmed today. I thought maybe that was just lore, but it's true. She's recently served as president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists, IAAE. Since leaving services at the World Bank, she's operated as an independent scholar and development economist, and she's currently affiliated with the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. She has 5 decades of experience in research, operations, policy analysis, and evaluation in the World Bank, universities, international organizations. I guess that's one of the benefits of finishing your PhD when you're 24. Among her notable works, and she's written many books, are Food Grain Marketing in India, Private Performance and Public Policy, The Design of Rural Development, Lessons from Africa, Managing Agricultural Development in Africa, Transitions in Development from Aid to Capital Flows, and International Property Rights in Agriculture, the World Bank's role in assisting borrower and member countries. And then also Managing a Global Resource, Challenges of Forest Conservation and Development. She's also written numerous papers on book chapters on agricultural productivity growth, structural transformation, and current in the changing roles of forests and water in the course of economic development. A senior advisor in the World Bank's Operations Evaluation Department, she led evaluations of the World Bank's forest strategy, the CGIAR in 2003, and the World Bank's approach to global programs in 2005. She's co-chaired numerous international task forces, including one, the China Council on Environment and Development in Forests and Grasslands, served on numerous panels as an independent external evaluator, including for the UN FAO in 2007. She's served on as advisor, expert, and award panels in international organizations, including Sasakawa 2000 program, the World Food Prize, the MacArthur Foundation. She's also spent time in the academy. She was a research professor at the University of Florida and director of international studies there. And she also established and directed the Global Development Initiative of the Carter Center in the Carnegie Corporation. She was on the founding board of the CGIAR Center for International Policy Research and a member of CGIAR Technical Advisory Committee. She's a fellow of the American Agriculture and Applied Economic Association and India's National Academy of Agricultural Sciences, among many other recognitions. If you'd like to look, this is a very abbreviated version. I really encourage you to look her up and see some of the other awards and things that she's done in her thought leadership throughout her career. I think it merits mentioning that she established an award for best research on gender in agriculture at the International Ag Economic Association. And in 2013, she established the Uma Lele Mentorship Program for students from developing countries at the American Ag Economic Association. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Uma's most recent book was released just 6 months ago in late 2021 by Oxford University Press. It's entitled Food for All, International Organizations in the Transformation of Agriculture. Thanks so much, Uma, for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm going to see if, can you see my PowerPoint? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you. It's a great pleasure, particularly to speak at Cornell, which is my alma mater, and I have great memories, also some difficult memories of being a student there, coming from India in my early 20s, in my teens actually, and having to walk in the winter for many years to finish my PhD. It was a lot of hard work. And so I have mixed memories of Cornell, the snowstorms and all everything I learned there, which was the launching pad for me for my career in the World Bank and elsewhere. So particular pleasure to speak at Cornell, and particularly about this new book, which someone casually suggested. You worked on international organizations for so long, why don't you write a book? And my advice after writing that book, which is 1007 pages, is not to do it. Don't accept people's advice and do it. It's a lot of hard work, and you think you know a lot, but writing a book is different than just talking about it. So I'm greatly relieved that the book has been released by Oxford University Press. And one of the things I've managed to do is to make sure that it was freely available to people, particularly students. So there is a link that you can get, and you can download the whole 1000-page book relatively easily. I wish you would do it, because there is only so little or so much I can say in a short period of time in trying to summarize the findings of this book. So its title is Food for All. And actually, when the crisis in the Soviet Union and Ukraine was not expected, and I thought, okay, the subject matter of the book would now recede in the background, but unfortunately it hasn't, for all the wrong reasons, because it's once again the largest humanitarian crisis, migrant labor, particularly to Europe, 7 million people displaced or more, I can't keep track of it. Food, fuel, fertilizer, and other commodity prices, commodity markets completely disrupted, slow global economic growth. And also, I think it's going to lead to, from what experts are saying, a disruption of global markets, which existed for all this time because of the impact of Soviet Union and Ukraine on food prices, fertilizer prices, energy markets, etc. So it's also led to slower global economic growth. And it's coming at a time when attention from SDGs was already a challenge. And I'll come back to it in a minute. But it's also on top of some major international changes that have taken place before the Russia-Ukraine crisis, which is the rise of China. It's become a major player in the world in a way it wasn't when I started working at the World Bank. Increase in the number of actors, which has completely fragmented the international assistance scene, and we are seeing the consequences of that in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, which are going to be the focus of my presentation. So even by just after 2015, it was becoming quite clear that there had been a slowdown in decline in poverty and hunger, and the optimism that led to the formation of SDGs was in a way beginning to erode. And this was even before the COVID crisis. COVID crisis is of course been a major global tragedy, particularly for the poorest people in the world. It has led to a lot of remigration of poor people to rural areas. And I'll discuss what structural transformation is, which is movement of population out of agriculture into the non-agricultural sector. But the reverse has been happening. So dependence on food and agricultural sectors has increased as a result of the COVID crisis. Climate change has contributed to additional problems. And one other major development is what economists call, like Barry Popkins, who used to be a student at Cornell, my contemporary, who's talked a lot about dietary transition. Unfortunately, dietary transition is leading to cheaper foods being consumed by poor people. And that's affordable because, understandable, because a very large share of their income goes into food. And as the prices become lower, they shift to junk food, which is causing obesity and incidence of non-communicable diseases at the same time. So we have multiple set of challenges that we face even before the Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine crisis. And that has compounded the problem because they are both major commodity exporters, as I said. So what do we find in terms of number of poor people in the world? On the left-hand side, or maybe on your right-hand side, you see this trend line, which shows a dramatic decline in the share of people living in poverty in China, the red line, and the green line is the not so dramatic decline in poverty in India. And other Asian countries shown in this graph, they're too small in relation to the population of India and China, that show that their poverty has also declined. In some ways, poverty has declined much more rapidly in Southeast Asia, together with China, than it is in India. So if we look at the, but the interesting thing on the left-hand side is the fact that if you look at the global share of poor people in the world, Sub-Saharan Africa still dominates. Nearly 2/3 of the global poor, according to the World Bank's $90 figure of poverty line, are in Sub-Saharan Africa and only 1/4 in South Asia. But if we look at hunger, we find that there is a much larger share of people in South Asia experiencing hunger, according to FAO data, than is the case for Sub-Saharan Africa. The percentages are lower. So in a way, there is a disjuncture between the estimates of decline in poverty, or levels and changes in poverty, and levels of changes in hunger. And we don't quite fully understand this relationship. The book goes to considerable extent in exploring this interaction between hunger and poverty than I have time to explain, but just to recognize that we still need to do a lot more work to understand what's going on in terms of relationship between poverty and hunger. So India has very large share of hunger, and so do African countries. So one of the issues that I explored in the book is there are these huge number of international consultations that took place, and we did systematic review of those international consultations after the food and financial crisis in 2007. And what we found is that there are all these consultations, but they don't really lead to anything concrete in terms of the kinds of steps that are needed to reduce poverty and hunger. And I'll come to that in a minute, but these are the most recent consultations, either have taken place or are underway, are going to take place. And I think one question is, what will that mean in concrete terms in changing the state of affairs? I've become somewhat skeptical about the extent to which global consultations are changing, taking major reforms and taking steps. So what is needed then to get from the current situation where SDGs are not being met, to make sure that nutritious diets are more affordable and accessible to all, which is the subject of my book. So on the supply side, it's quite well known that we need substantial increase in production and productivity and trade, particularly making sure that trade is not constrained by trade imposition of trade bans in countries, especially in times of crisis, to make sure that food is available to countries that are lacking in food supply. But currently we find that nearly 3 billion people in the world don't have enough income to be able to access healthy foods. And there is an estimate of approximately $15 billion needed incrementally every year to increase the supply of food and to, on the demand side, to increase employment, on increase consumer education, improve value chains, increase physical infrastructure, and also improve the behavior of the private sector through food safety regulations, etc. So it's a huge agenda, both on the demand side, on the supply side, that needs to be addressed. And so we look at that huge agenda in the context of structural transformation, a framework that W. Arthur Lewis, Nobel Prize winning economist, and Bruce Johnston and John Mellor wrote about a lot. And what does structural transformation mean? It means decline in the share of GDP in agriculture, growth in total factor productivity, demographic transition, overall income growth. And recently there has been a concern that industrialization and growth in manufacturing, which occurred in the earlier period in the countries that are now called the Asian tigers, is not happening to the same extent. So manufacturing employment is not being created. So if we look at these different elements of structural transformation, as we did in our book, we find that among the 130 countries for which we analyze data, countries that have had slow growth in productivity in agriculture have also been lagging in structural transformation. And most of this poverty has been concentrated in rural areas for the reasons that I will explain in a minute. So one of the characteristics of structural transformation is the decline in the share of agriculture, forestry, and fisheries in value added in GDP. And you can see that there's been a rapid decline in that share in almost all countries. That pattern is almost uniform. But what we find, for instance, the purple line at the bottom is South Korea, and its decline was very rapid, followed by China with a red line, which also shows a very rapid decline. And India is somewhere above that, which means its decline in GDP value added in agriculture hasn't been as rapid. And countries that are lagging behind, like Nepal, which is the blue line, you find has not been declining as rapidly. On the right-hand side, you see the same numbers with using 1985 as a base, which was easier because Vietnam had not come on the stream and we didn't have data for the earlier period. So this shows you how different countries have their share in GDP, share of agriculture in GDP has declined at different rates. And this is the number on the employment in agriculture, the share of population that depends on agriculture, which is modeled by ILO. And what is striking again is that South Korea was way ahead of other Asian countries in very rapid decline in employment in agriculture, followed by these countries in China, East Asia, and India's decline has not been as rapid as is its decline in value added in GDP in agriculture. What does that mean? That means more people are dependent on agriculture in terms of employment, than they are in terms of value added, which tells you that majority of the population in these countries is in rural areas. And so in order to reduce poverty, we need to focus a lot more on rural areas. And South and Southeast Asian, East Asian and Southeast Asian countries in that regard have done much better than has South Asia and Nepal. So now we look at the next component of this structural transformation, which is productivity growth. And again, the differences among countries are very striking. The purple line, light one, is South Korea, and its productivity growth was very rapid. And then followed by China, the red line, productivity growth again much more rapid. And India, which had a green revolution and one had hope that its productivity growth will continue, hasn't done as well as it has, as have East Asian countries. So the combination of slow growth in productivity despite the green revolution and GDP decline shares, you see that dependence on food and agriculture is much greater in countries that are lagging behind. And on the right-hand side, I can't see this because there is, sorry, on the right-hand side are the productivity growth by regions. And what is striking again is that East Asia looks very good in terms of its total factor productivity in agriculture. These are numbers done by Keith Fogley. And the productivity growth in sub-Saharan Africa is the lowest. And South Asia is kind of somewhere in between. So it hasn't done as badly on structural transformation as African countries, but not as well as East and Southeast Asian countries. Another issue which I've discussed at some considerable length in the book is that there used to be a widespread belief that smallholders are more productive than large farms. And in fact, a huge amount of support by international organizations to smallholder agriculture comes from this belief that smallholders are more productive than large farms. That was mainly because they were mobilizing their own labor and they were applying that to their farms, and that showed high rate of productivity. But as capital markets, labor markets, and financial sector have grown, you see that fundamental truth about small farms being more productive than large farms doesn't exist anymore. And again, Keith Fogley has done some very pioneering work in showing that it's a U-shaped U-shaped curve in terms of behavior of productivity. You find that countries at early stage of development have high level of productivity, but as the farm size increases, productivity of middle-sized farms doesn't increase, but the large farms increases considerably, as is the case in countries like Brazil. So the world has become more differentiated, not just in terms of productivity growth, but farm size that is contributing to this productivity growth. And in looking at the future, we need to look at what this means in terms of global trade, consolidation of farms, etc. The third element of structural transformation is demographic transition. And one can see that China's demographic transition has been much more rapid. It's had reached a peak of its population in about 2020, whereas India's population growth is still increasing rapidly. And there is a lot of debate among economists about whether this is a so-called demographic dividend, as many have liked to believe, or a demographic curse. And the reason why I say that we still don't know whether it is a dividend or a curse is because if you don't invest in your population, in education and training, etc., the labor is not particularly productive. And so it doesn't create productive employment, it just leads to more manual labor. And as you will see, countries like India, in South Asia and Africa haven't invested enough in their education of their labor force to make this so-called demographic dividend as a benefit to them as distinct from a curse. And if we divide this problem even further and look at the education and labor force participation of men and women, and I've done some papers on this, it shows that China has a very high labor force participation. Already nearly 60% of the labor in labor force in China participates, and equal number of women participate in the labor force. Whereas in India, which in a way straight kind of an outlier, women have been dropping out of labor force. And as a result, they are not contributing as much to structural transformation. And it has some implications for the future. Vietnam, by the way, surprisingly is doing quite well, both in terms of demographic transition, but also industrialization. So the next important question is domestic savings and investments. It is a question that most economists, ag economists particularly, don't look at the macro level. And what is surprising to many people who look at these numbers is that, again, East Asia, the blue line, shows the very high rates of savings in East Asian countries, which have been growing at more than 45% a year at the peak, and now they have declined recently. Whereas in Africa, which is the red line, rate of savings has been much lower, and it has been declining over time. And what does it mean in terms of gross fixed capital formation as share of GDP? East Asia, again, is one of the major investors in their economies in multiple ways. And South Asia is not doing very badly. Its saving and investment rates had gone up, but again declined after the 2007 financial crisis. And this declining rate is rather disconcerting in case of South Asia. And the countries in Latin America have never been big savers, including Brazil, very high per capita income country, and their investment rates have not been much very attractive. So if we break down this further in terms of where are countries investing, what is striking is that China again rises to the top because of its very rapid increase in gross fixed capital formation in agriculture. And that means it has invested a whole lot in the agriculture and rural sector to increase its TF, total factor productivity growth, as I pointed out earlier in the figures that I showed of TFP growth. And another interesting factor in case of China is huge foreign direct investment inflows in China, say compared to South Asia. The green line is India, the red line is, what is the red line? So rates of capital formation in the agricultural sector itself have been very different in the different regions of the world, and they explain the TFP growth. Now, what is interesting is that this figure shows the global world food prices, and foreign assistance. The dotted line is foreign assistance as share of share of IBRD lending to food and agriculture, the dotted line. And what is very striking is that when the world food prices increased in 1974-75, there was a huge increase in investments in the 1970s by World Bank and IDA and other donors too, leading to increased investment in food and agriculture. Whereas as prices declined over time, and this shows the decline in prices, these different lines here, the share of investment going to food and agriculture did not keep up with the big, in a way they were responding to price changes rather than looking at the extent of poverty in the rural sector. And now prices have become much more unstable, and you see these peaks from time to time. Donors respond to these price changes. So this next figure shows the share of total aid, which was already low, total aid going to agriculture, which is this line here, which was already low and has been declining since the peak it reached in 1980s. And it is only 0.3% of the income of industrial countries that is going into ODA, which is in agriculture, and a declining share of that is going to food and agriculture. So one of the big messages of my book is that we are not investing enough in food and agriculture and related sectors. Nevertheless, international organizations have played a very major role in food and agriculture. And there are 5 chapters I have in my book which discuss the key role that the international architecture has played in making sure that agriculture is being paid attention to in international organizations. So Bretton Woods institutions were formed in the 1940s. FAO was established. Its first session took place in 1945, but it has played a major role in establishing standards and international agreements. CGIAR was created in 1971, and it played, even before the CGIAR was created, which is the largest network of agricultural systems. They had the 2 or 3 centers that existed prior to CGIAR, played a major role in the generation of the Green Revolution. The World Food Program, which was started as a bilateral assistance program by US to deal with its surplus food, eventually became an international organization. And now it has been the largest growth industry. Already before the Russia-Ukraine crisis, WFP was feeding nearly 75 million involuntarily displaced people in the world. And that number has now increased to nearly 85 million. The number keeps on changing. WFP keeps on asking for more emergency assistance. It does a great job of doing it, but the demand for emergency assistance is still nowhere near what is needed in order to feed these involuntarily displaced people. IFAD was again created by the international community as a result of surplus oil revenues to deal with small and marginal farmers. And again, it has played a major role. US bilateral assistance has been key in also being a shareholder in the World Bank and all these international organizations. And their functions, in a way, the more you look at them, they're highly complementary to each other. But are they playing a major role in being complements to each other rather than sometimes competing with each other? I point out in the book that there needs to be more reform in the international organizations to make them much more effective, given the fact that they're already providing relatively small amount of assistance in relation to the needs of the countries. So the next few slides I'm going to show you are a unique data set which comes from the World Bank's record of implementation of food and agricultural projects in the world over the last 40 years. So it's a long database of more than 2,000 projects. And in this particular figure, it shows regional performance, average regional performance over time. And you can see that by and large, countries were doing well in the 1970s. There was a big decline in their performance in food and agriculture in the 1980s, because 81 to 90 was a period of structural adjustment, conditionality, decline in aid to food and agriculture, and generally major macroeconomic problems. Their performance overall increased over time. But what is striking is that Africa always remains at the bottom. Even when its performance increases, it's always at the bottom of the rung in terms of its performance of these projects that the World Bank has been financing. So one of the questions is, why is it that African continent has been doing less well than, say, East Asia or Eastern Europe and Central Asia? And this next data set is about individual countries. It shows that Vietnam has had the largest number of best implemented projects among the ratings given by the World Bank over time, followed by China, followed by Turkey, etc. And India, which has received the largest amount of IDA funds from the World Bank, hasn't done necessarily that well. So, and as you go down the line on the right-hand side, you see that African countries by and large have performed, individual countries perform much less well than have regions, aggregate regions. So that tells you that the performance is poorer in part because they don't really have the capacity to plan and implement their projects. This is the investigations that we did in the book to show that by and large, countries like China and Vietnam prepare their own projects, which means they have much more understanding of the precise constraints that need to be addressed in their own countries. They have much more sense of ownership about how to deal with their problems, and therefore much greater commitment to implementing these projects. And that explains why Vietnam and China and in Turkey, for instance, do much better. Even Bangladesh does much better than India. Interestingly, it used to be described as a basket case, as you know, when it became independent, and Bangladesh overall has been doing much better than India. So it tells you a lot about how these issues are country specific, why we need to look at each of those countries in terms of their many different dimensions: TFP growth, capacity building, their existing capacity, their institutions, technological change, and savings and investments. So then to summarize, then what does agricultural transformation in these countries need? First and foremost, there is a huge need for investments in agriculture and rural development, including in the big 5 international organizations. Economists have estimated this to be about $15 billion annually incremental investments needed compared to what exists now. And that includes investment in digital agriculture. It also, beyond the 15 billion, it requires investment in education, health, and infrastructure, in domestic capacity, in value chains, etc. It also needs sound policy capacity in the countries. And especially as the external shocks have occurred in the last 40, 50 years, they've told us a lot about what is needed in countries that are at early stages of development, when there is climate change, loss of biodiversity, pandemics, all of these external shocks make it very necessary that developing countries have the capacity to deal with those while maintaining a steady flow of policy framework in their own countries too. Another thing that is needed is diversification of production. There has been a huge obsession in developing countries on wheat, rice, and maize. And that's in a way an outcome of the historic reasons why when there was hunger, what was needed was increase in calories. And when there was new technology available for wheat and rice, the Green Revolution was a major source of that increase in productivity. The focus was very much on wheat and rice. But now we need much more diversified food and agricultural production. And what I find is that in India, for instance, the production of fruits and vegetables together is now much larger than grain production. But it's still not reaching poor people for the reasons that I was pointing out, because effective demand doesn't exist. So another important dimension of productivity growth is that we need to get away from just focusing on yield growth to ecosystem services and to promote payments for ecosystem services, something we started in a task force that I was chairing China in 2002, 2001, 2002, when the Chinese formed a task force to promote, first to deal with their terrible policy of banning, imposing a logging ban on forests. And we persuaded them to shift from adopting a logging ban to payments for environmental services, which meant that you provide incentives to small farmers to plant more trees rather than punishing them for cutting trees. And it has been such an immensely effective program in China that their own acreage of underforestry has increased by 40 million hectares in the last 20 years or so. So there is a lot that can be done to introduce payments for environmental services and adopt in general a transformative interdisciplinary approach to food and agriculture. So that is my message: invest more, build capacity, build policies and institutions that will enable productivity to grow in agriculture and achieve food and food security and reduce poverty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Uma, for those highlights of your book. Questions, and then we'll open it up for questions online as well. Let me start in the room, however. Questions? Let me start with one while people are formulating their questions. You mentioned that perhaps we need to double the investment in agriculture and rural development in the big five international institutions. How optimistic are you about that? And do you feel that any of the global political trends toward more populist nationalism and so on may impact that goal or that observed need?
I should clarify and say that the $15 billion are not just to invest in international institutions, but also in developing countries. And so, as I pointed out, gross fixed capital formation in developing countries has not done as well as it should. So it's a combination of investing in international organizations as well as in developing countries. And $15 billion is what economists are saying is needed, incremental investment needed. I think one of the problems is that developing countries themselves are not giving as much attention to their food and agriculture as they should do. And in that sense, China again stands out. China and Southeast Asian countries stand out as being much more committed to developing their agriculture, which means they have also transformed their economies much more rapidly from being predominantly dependent on agriculture. It's ironic that the less you support agriculture, the more dependent your poor people become on agriculture. So this is a plea for more investment in international organizations as well as in developing countries' economies. And am I optimistic about it? I don't know, but I have to be if we are going to look forward to reducing poverty and hunger. I think if we look at the case of CGIAR, and I have a big chapter on the CGIAR in the book, I show that since it was formed, there have been many reforms in the CGIAR. Most of them were done at the prompting of donors who wanted one thing or another done by the CGIAR, and by and large, CGIAR system responded and reformed, but it never really got the additional resources that were needed. For a brief period after 2007-8 to 2014, there was some increase in support to CGIAR, but 2014 was the peak period of assistance, nearly 850 million or something like this. So one of the problems is not enough support for CGIAR. And another big problem with the CGIAR is that most of that funding has become highly fragmented. Unlike in the past, when there was support for just general agreement on key priorities for the CGIAR, now the donors are giving small amount of money to centers and also expecting them to do much more downstream work. And it's ironic because developing countries themselves haven't been investing enough in research and technology. The donors are expecting CGIAR to do what national systems should do. So as a result, the CGIAR has over time moved from being an institution that provides global and regional public goods, as it did in the beginning, to doing much more downstream work on achieving impact on food security and poverty reduction. And I point out that different organizations have different comparative advantages. CGIR's comparative advantage is not to do downstream work to reduce food security and reduce hunger. It is to do upstream research that developing countries' national systems can then take up and do their own research to adapt their own systems. So to increase investments is necessary but not sufficient. How it is done, at what level, at the global level, regional level, national level, is quite important. And it's the complementarity between all those different levels in each organization that's quite important. So the case of CGIAR shows that there is a clear case for more investment in CGIAR, and despite the latest reforms of one CGIAR, there isn't enough investment. In case of FAO, I point out that FAO's resources, which are based on assessed contributions by countries, which haven't increased over time. And as a result, demands on FAO have increased a lot, but the resources available to it haven't increased. Again, a case for investing much more in FAO than is the case otherwise. So each of those, I think the World Bank, in a way, I would say, is a positive case. World Bank has been good at being able to raise IDA money. Its last replenishments are about $95 million. Look at it compared to 1 billion needed in the CGIAR. So I think there is something that the bank is doing well, and we need to understand more what that is, more confidence of donors in the World Bank than there seems to have in FAO or CGIAR. But in general, collectively, we need to address these questions of more investment, what is needed to support international organizations and increase the complementarity between them and developing countries' investments rather than competition as happening now.
Okay, thank you very much. Uma, we have to vacate our classroom for another class coming in now, but thank you so much. Please join me again in thanking Uma Lele.
Thank you.